Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I apologize that Secretary Vandervaart could not be here. But before I get started, let me share with you a vision, if you don't mind. Imagine, if you will, a farm, perhaps a farm out west. And the farmer comes out for the day to do his work. And as he steps outside, he sees a car coming down the drive. And the car pulls up, and out from the car steps a young man. The young man steps over to the farmer and says, "Sir, I'm from the federal government, and I'm a water inspector, and I'm here to inspect your farm. I can look anywhere I'd like." And he proceeds to take out his badge, and he shows the farmer his badge. Puts it away. The farmer is very nice and says, very polite, says, "Well, it's great to have you here, young man. Please feel free to look anywhere you'd like, except over here." And the young man says, pulls that badge back out and says, "I don't think you understood me. I'm from the federal government. I can go anywhere I'd like. And this badge tells me and tells you that I can go anywhere I'd like." Well, the farmer says, "Well, that's fine, son." And the farmer goes and gets on his tractor. And about 5 minutes later, he hears screaming and yelling. And he looks towards that field where he told that young man not to go. And he sees that young man running. And he's running because about 20 feet behind him is a giant bull that is bearing down on him. The farmer hops off that tractor and he runs over to that field. He jumps up on the fence and he says, son, show him your badge." And I apologize. I don't think the secretary would tell a joke like that. But I heard that, I got that actually from my parish priest. I forgot the sermon, but I did remember the joke. Probably not very good either. I love coming to an event like this, and the secretary would as well, because I love economic development. Now, why is somebody from the Department of Environmental Quality so excited to be in an event like this talking about economic development? I can tell you why. Because the department, the secretary, we understand that economic development and environmental protection go hand in hand. You simply cannot have one without the other. There's not a society, there's not a city, there's not a state, there's not a country where you go and look, and if they have superior environmental performance, by that I mean clean air and clean water and clean land, where you do not have a robust economy. Simply does not exist. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone here. As a young man, I was able to go to Berlin prior to the fall of the wall. So it was about 1986. And there in Berlin, very close to the wall, what was the wall at the time, separating East and West Berlin, is the Kaiser Wilhelm church. It was actually built in the 1890s, I think. But you could go up in that structure and actually look out on that, on the city. And it was amazing as a young person to see that, because what you could see on the West Berlin side, up in the tower, I went up at night, and you could see what a free market looks like, and then literally turn your head and see what a centrally controlled market looks like. So it was a stark contrast. But I say that because you also then recognize that when the wall fell, what we found behind that wall was an environment that was severely damaged. And it wasn't because they didn't have laws and rules. Anybody who knows the German code knows they have a rule for everything. It wasn't because they didn't have enough rules. They didn't have an economy that would support implementing those rules. So we get it very much at the Department of Environmental Quality that economic development goes hand in hand. In fact, it begets environmental protection. So the better job you do at bringing in business, the better job I can do at protecting the environment. We understand that. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about customer service very briefly. Then we'll talk about, for a little bit, about energy and some of the things that we're doing at the department and at the state. And then at last, I've got a sort of a miscellaneous observation or two. First, customer service. I can just about guarantee you that you've been in a meeting like this, right? If you're in economic development or you're a business. And this is I'll call it a pedagogical semi-true story. And for those of you who went to Carolina, pedagogical means educational. A company, a young plant engineer comes in and he comes to the state. He maybe brings along someone like a van over here, economic development person who brings him along to meet the state regulator. And he comes in, he's very excited. And he says, "Sir, I've got a great project. We're going to expand our operations. We're going to hire 50 new people. It's just outstanding. I just need to get my environmental permits." And the regulator looks at him and says, "Sir, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll look at your PM, PM10, SO2, NOx, VOCs, and CO, and if you're below the major source threshold, you can get a synthetic minor permit. If you're above the major source permit, you'll get a Title V permit. If you're above the PSD threshold, then you're going to get a PSD permit, but don't worry, you just have to install BACT. Unless you're in a non-attainment area, you install LA. And we'll look at your HAPs. If your HAPs are above the federal threshold level, then you'll install MACT. If below the federal threshold level, you'll install GACT. Oh, but don't worry, we got a state program. We'll look at your TAPs. If your TAPs are below the TEPR, you got to demonstrate compliance with the AAL. But don't worry about that. If you're over the AAL, you just do MFCT. And I could go on. Very impressive. And by that time, the young man who comes in, or the plant manager or plant engineer who was very excited at the time, but by the time they're done, he's got a bit of a bovine stare on his face. Right? The energy's gone, excitement's gone. He looks at you and says, "I don't have any idea what you just said. I do know that my plant manager told me I need to get the permit ASAP." At which time the regulator responds and says, "What is ASAP?" And I say that, I mean, again, it was a semi-true story, but it highlights the need for our department to provide customer service to everyone that we come in contact with, and not primarily, but importantly, economic development folks and businesses that come talk to us. Because I can do that. Our folks can get so caught up in this regulatory minutia that when you bring them to us, that's what they hear. So we have to be very cognizant of customer service. And when Secretary John Scavarli, who is now the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, came to DEQ some 3 years ago, almost 4, he instituted a cultural change of customer service. And he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that when you came to see us, you were going to get outstanding customer service. Now, I'd like to think that we were 100% successful. I'm sure we weren't, but I hope we've made a change. I hope when you come see us and you're looking at an economic development opportunity that we listen, okay, and we get you the answer in a professional and prompt manner. And that's what we expect of every one of our employees. I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, and a gentleman, at question time said, "I do want to commend you. I've been dealing with a particular division, and they've been doing a great job at customer service." And I said, "Well, that's great." I said, "We expect that. Thank you very much." But I also wanted to make sure that he was, and I told him, I said, "Did you get the right answer?" And he sort of scratched his head a little bit, and he said, "Well, I assume I did get the right answer." And I explained to him, I said, "Let me make sure that the answer should be right for the environment and for your economy. If I give you an answer that is too expensive or an option that you can't live with, you're not going to build here. You're not going to expand here. I should be able to give you an answer." Now, I'm bound by, a lot of times, by federal regulations, but there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of ways that we can work within that. We're never going to bend the rules, but I can tell you there's a lot of options within those rules. And we should be talking to you about that, and we should be offering that to you. So you need to get the right answer. Again, at the end of the day, you're going to get the answer defined by the regulations. We're never going to bend the regulations. But at the same time, there are a number of options within these regulations that we should be able to provide to you. So also, customer service serves another function. It's just not our obligation to you. It improves the environment. If I can do a better job explaining the obligations of companies to them, they'll do a better job complying. That's going to improve the environment. Okay, so we have a self-interest in doing that. So again, customer service is very important to us. If you're not getting customer service, you call the secretary, you call me, and we'll put Tom Reeder on. Anybody know Tom Reeder? He's our assistant secretary, former lieutenant colonel, and when things need doing, he does them. So we will get that done. We want to hear about those experiences where you didn't get it as well. We really do, because we want to improve. It's important to us. Let's talk about energy for a little bit. When we basically renamed the Department of Environmental Quality a couple of, going on 8-9 months ago, we actually took the opportunity to reform part of our department, and we now have a dedicated energy section led by a very talented woman named Jenny Kelvington, and she is very focused on energy issues. We understand that energy is critical to everything you do. It's critical to economic development because low energy prices is a draw for industry, for manufacturing. And we need to maintain affordable energy for economic development. It needs to be clean, affordable energy, but we can do that, and we've proven in North Carolina that we can do that. Low energy prices are also the best weapon against poverty. You know, the poorest of us, among us, pay a large percentage of their income on energy cost. And we need to be cognizant of that, and everything we do, we take that into account. So when we look for energy, when we talk about energy policy, and we have all of the above energy policy, and we truly do, we support all types of energy in North Carolina. But we always want to keep our eye on being clean and being affordable. Let's talk about offshore energy just for a minute. For the last year and a half, we worked with the federal government, almost 2 years with the federal government, hoping that the federal government would open the Mid-Atlantic to offshore oil and gas leasing. Unfortunately, in March of this year, sort of a unusual situation, we were removed. The Mid-Atlantic was removed from the next sort of federal cycle of offshore leases. We were very disappointed in this. It was an opportunity for North Carolina, particularly eastern North Carolina, to benefit from millions of dollars, billions of dollars of economic development, thousands of jobs. Again, we believe that we can obtain these resources. We can do it safely. Again, we were working with the federal government to demonstrate that, and at the very last minute, they removed the Mid-Atlantic. We were very disappointed in that. I will say at the same time, we were not going to, as an administration, support the opening of the Mid-Atlantic without revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was very important. Revenue sharing from the federal government would have funneled hundreds of millions of dollars to North Carolina that we could then provide to the coastal communities to help their infrastructure and to help them prepare for contingencies associated with offshore oil and gas. So we were never going to support it if we didn't get revenue sharing, and the federal government didn't seem to be interested in either, one, revenue sharing, or two, looking at what we have in the Mid-Atlantic in terms of resources. We're still very interested in seeing what we have out there. Some of the data, although it's 30 years old, shows that there are significant resources in the Mid-Atlantic, and so we'd like to continue to look at that. On a more positive side, it looks like the federal government will open an area for a wind lease. Probably, my folks were telling me, 2017 timeframe off the coast of Kitty Hawk. There may be a lease opportunity or lease development opportunity for offshore wind there. So we're encouraged by that. In the case of offshore wind and oil, we were very consistent as an administration that we want to protect our viewshed from any of these projects. So we recommended, I think it was a 25 mile off the coast So we protected that viewshed and protected tourism because it's such an important part of what we do in North Carolina, who we are. So that's sort of the offshore oil, gas, and wind. Solar, I think some of the slides earlier from John showed that we are a leader in solar in North Carolina. We think it's an absolutely important part of what we do. It makes up an important part of how we provide electricity. At the same time, we have to be cognizant of some of the issues that come along with solar. Solar, I tell folks that, again, solar is important. We support solar, and it plays an important role. But I don't want folks to think that solar is the answer yet. There is no storage. So solar works when it wants to, okay? And it's also, in that sense, not per se carbon-free. It's carbon-free when it generates, but in the early morning, in the evening, if you've got a 24/7 manufacturing, it's not running on solar. It's running on some other fuel. And that's okay. I always say that some of the base load fuel that supports solar, like a natural gas combined power plant, they complement each other. And so it's good to have all of these. It's good to have solar because it diversifies our fuel, our energy sector, and it's a hedge against energy price increases from natural gas. So again, we very much support solar. There have been concerns raised to us more recently, now that we have become so successful in North Carolina. In the fourth quarter of last year, 30% of all solar installations in the U.S. occurred right here in North Carolina, and most of those in eastern North Carolina. So as you drive across eastern North Carolina, you see a lot of solar farms. There have been some concerns raised about what happens to those solar farms at the end of their life, at the end of their useful life, 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the manufacturer. We are concerned about that. Some of the farmers have expressed concern about what happens to their land during this time. Can it be reused? Who will remove these things? And we have a lot of very good solar companies in North Carolina that are very responsible. And we think they're doing a pretty good job. At the same time, we are also looking at ways to ensure that. We do not want, at the end of 15, 20 years, for a large solar farm to be abandoned and then a local government or a citizen having to deal with that disposal. So we're looking at ways to do that. We talked about a bonding requirement, which is not really unusual. The solar folks, while they were a little bit skeptical, they acknowledge that they suggest that the value at the end of life of a solar farm is so high in terms of reclaimed aluminum and other parts that it should be no problem. In other words, people will come to take these away. And if that is in fact true, and I believe it could be true, then a bonding requirement would have very little impact. So we're considering it because we have to have the foresight, okay? We don't want to be in a position 20 years from now saying, who's going to take care of these solar panels that are out there? We did that with coal ash. All right, I still spend 50% of my time every single day dealing with coal ash. Now, I'm not suggesting they are even close to the same magnitude. My only point is that as an environmentalist, I've got to look at the pros and cons of what's going on and then plan for the future. So I want to make sure that your communities are protected against any potential harm, the cons of a solar farm. There are plenty of pros for solar farms, but we want to make sure we're looking down the road. I want to talk to you just a minute about something. Grid security is something we're very interested in. Electromagnetic pulse attacks, EMPs, have anybody heard of those? Cyber attacks. I know electricity is probably here. Cyber attacks on electric grid, that is becoming a big concern throughout the country. And North Carolina has been a leader in a lot of areas. We've been a leader on coal ash. We've been a leader on solar. We've been a lot in our department, environmental quality and energy. We want to be a leader in grid security. So we want to help identify those issues on grid security and make sure that the grid is secure and safe from cyber attack. We've got a lot of electronics now that run our grid, and they are more susceptible. As we have distributed generation, whether it's solar or wind, there are more access points to the grid, making it more vulnerable. So we've got to take care of that. Now, Why would you care about that as an economic developer? Grid security, I mean, it's not very sexy, I get it. But I could imagine in a couple of years it's going to be very important. It's already important to us now, but in a couple of years it's going to be really important. When you're trying to locate a business here and it's an energy-intensive business, they're going to look for things like grid security. Military makes up a huge portion of our economy in eastern North Carolina. When they're looking at locating a new fighter wing or maintaining an installation, the ability to ensure that they have secured electrical grid may be a factor in the decision to site here or to keep an operation here. So we're looking forward at grid security. In fact, we've got the Environmental Policy Council meeting on May 18th, which is all about grid security. So if you're interested in that, May 18th. It also then leads me to, from an energy standpoint, base load. Wouldn't surprise anybody here as we begin to ramp up solar. Solar, despite the fact that we've got lots of solar out there, it only now makes up about 2% of our energy mix in North Carolina. It's about ballpark 30% coal-fired power plants, 30% natural gas, and 30% nuclear. I wouldn't surprise you by telling you that coal-fired power plants are going away. The regulations are so stringent, no one's building them, they're too costly with the regulations to operate, they're going to go away. So there's your 30% going down. Nuclear, when was the last time we built a nuclear plant in North Carolina? Right? Scores of years ago. And they are going to retire. In 2030 time frame, they're going to retire. So that's going to go down. The last thing we're left with, ladies and gentlemen, is natural gas. Now, natural gas is, because of the fracking revolution or the hydraulic fracturing revolution, we've been able to use a lot more natural gas. The real question we have in North Carolina and across the country is whether we want to put all of our resources and all of our eggs in one basket, the natural gas basket. If we're at 30% now, it's going to be 35, 38 in 5 or 10 years. If we get up to 40, 50% natural gas, everybody in this room, I'm looking around everybody in this room, and for the most part, you're old enough to remember the natural gas spikes in prices. If we're at 50% reliance on natural gas and the price goes up to what it was in 2005, our economy is in deep trouble. So my point is we've got to, just like solar panels and thinking 10, 15 years down the line, we've got to start thinking down the line for base load electric generation. And we think that nuclear can be part of that mix. Nuclear is carbon-free. It is expensive up front. No question it's expensive up front. But it's a 60-year plant, and usually with a 20-year extension. So you're probably looking at an 80-year financing. At 80 years and a 95% capacity factor for nuclear, it becomes cost-effective. But it takes vision. It takes foresight. It takes planning. So as we move forward and looking at our energy mix in North Carolina, trying to keep that energy clean and affordable, that's one of the things we're looking at right now. How do we work that in? There are a couple plants that are going in South Carolina and Georgia. We're going to learn a lot from them. Also, when we develop nuclear in North Carolina, most people don't know it, but we've got GE is a huge nuclear presence in North Carolina from an engineering and fuels capacity. They're huge. We've got our university system. So as we develop and think about nuclear, it's not just the plant, it's all the associated growth that goes along with that. So we think it's an important thing to look towards the future on. So that's something we're looking for in terms of base load generation. Another energy issue is the federal power plan. How many here are familiar with the federal power plan? I just want to make sure anybody? No? A couple of people sort of sheepishly raised their hand. Last summer, the Obama administration proposed a federal power plan, which will effectively take over the way energy is generated and distributed and consumed in America, and particularly in North Carolina. They will define a central planned operation will define how you generate electricity. It will define when you use electricity. Okay? It's expected to cost $30 billion a year in implementation. It will increase rates in North Carolina, residential rates, about 24%. It'll increase industrial rates 10 to 30%, depending on which estimates you're looking at. And again, this is a federal power plan. That was proposed last summer. We had been tracking it for quite some time. We were very concerned. One is it's a federal plan. We don't necessarily think we need the federal government to tell North Carolinians how to run their state. We've done an excellent job protecting our environment over the last 25 years while keeping energy affordable. We thought it was federal overreach. Now, at the same time, as an environmentalist, I just gave you all of the economic impacts, right? I told you $30 billion a year. I told you your residential rates would go up by 25%. I told you your industrial rates would go up by 10 to 30. And as an economic developer, do you think you can recruit people to North Carolina when you tell them that their electricity rates are going to go up 30%? Is that going to make it easier for you to recruit business? I don't think it is. But I have to look at the environmental benefit of the federal power plan. What was the environmental benefit of the federal power plan? Got it? Zero. It did not, by EPA's own admission, does not move the needle on climate change. No temperature change as a result of this particular rule. Zero. There were no benefits in terms of health benefits in North Carolina. You may not know it, but you should. North Carolina is meeting every federal air quality standard right now. First time in 18 years. Our citizens, our people, you all made a commitment to clean our environment. We've done that. So the benefits that the federal government claims will result from this rule simply do not accrue in North Carolina because we've already made that investment. We've already cleaned our air. So again, I'm looking at a very costly rule and a rule that doesn't really help the environment. It's an easy decision for me. And in fact, the governor instructed Secretary Vandervaart to do what he could to prevent this federal takeover. And we did. We sued the EPA along with several other states, and for the first time ever, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay of a federal rule at this level. So it's going to be heard here in the next couple of months by the lower court, and the rule cannot go into effect until the Supreme Court looks at this rule. It is based on very dubious legal grounds. I spent a couple of years as a litigator, and I suspect this rule will not survive. I hope it doesn't, because it's not good for North Carolina. At the same time, so we got the stay, so we're safe for a little while. We have to keep our eye on that ball. We're going to continue to do what's right for North Carolina. Again, we've proven that, folks. We have the cleanest air we've had in 18 years. We have affordable energy right now. We're mixing in the diversity of solar and wind, which are important. We can do what's right for North Carolina. We don't need the federal government to help us do that. All right. I've got a few minutes. So I'm going to get to the sort of miscellaneous. That's sort of the energy overview of the things that we're working on, things that we're looking at. I said before customer service, I had that gentleman come up and say, hey, I had great customer service, and I asked him, did you get the right answer? Because I think the right answer is the answer that protects the environment at the lowest possible cost. That's important to us. In 2014, we used some of the latest science to repeal a law that we no longer needed. It didn't affect necessarily here in eastern North Carolina, but the Triad, the Triangle, and Charlotte were being forced by a federal rule to use specially formulated gasoline. Turns out that the specially formulated gasoline did not help the environment in North Carolina. It did nothing. It did raise gasoline prices by about 7 cents a gallon. And so we were able to, with the latest science, demonstrate that we didn't need that. We saved drivers in just the Triad and Triangle about $18 million during the summer of 2014. We've rolled that out to Charlotte now. And so gas prices, as a result of certainly, oil production, but certainly getting rid of unnecessary requirements. That's the sort of right answer that we're looking for. We have to go back and look at all of our regulations and ask, are we getting the bang for the buck? And we do that all the time. That's an example. This particular year, what we're going to request, and we've already looked at it, when you go into your, annually you get your car inspected, right? And a lot of counties have an inspection requirement for safety, but they also have the emissions check, right? Well, it turns out when we put those emissions check requirements in across the state, we didn't put it in all counties, we put it in many of them. They were unnecessary in many counties. They're still necessary in the very metropolitan areas, but there are 31 counties across this state when we've demonstrated that that emission check requirement is unnecessary for the purpose of protecting air quality. Guys, it was pretty simple. We got engineers that work for us. We got the best scientific tools. We put them together. We said, we can get rid of this requirement. By getting rid of this requirement and changing the inspection cycle to every 2 years, the emissions, we're going to save, in the 31 counties in North Carolina, $57 million a year. And we can do that without adversely impacting our environment. That's the right answer, okay? And as economic developers, if you see a situation, if you come talk to me, and again, I hope you get great customer service, if you come to me, but I give you an answer that's not right, you can do a better job at a lower cost, I want to hear about it. Now, some I can't fix, some are federal, but I'll sue the federal government when necessary. Put me in that briar patch. But again, we're committed to doing that because that's our job, folks, is to protect the environment, but do it at the lowest possible cost. And we're doing that. We have the cleanest air, cleanest water that we've ever had in North Carolina. Okay? So we can do that job. The last issue I want to talk about is another federal rule. I've talked about that federal power plan that was going to really drive rates up for no good reason. Well, we've got another one of these federal overreach rules, and some of you might have heard it, Waters of the U.S. And that is a particularly pernicious rule in eastern North Carolina. The federal government has, in economic development, I'm sure one of the things you do when you go looking for sites, you're looking for sites that do not impact wetlands. And that's great. I don't want you to impact wetlands. But if you do have an economic development site where you impact wetlands, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in mitigation. It's going to cost you in engineering. It's going to cost you in time, right? And they're all important because we want to protect that water quality. And we've done that. Again, we've shown we can do that. The federal government, however, last summer, again, issued a Waters of the United States rule which redefined the extent of these wetlands. It used to be you and I, maybe in a sort of common sense, could go out there and look at an area and determine whether this is wetlands and therefore under federal jurisdiction. Well, now, under this new rule, it's not only the area that you and I would agree upon as maybe a wetland, it is areas well beyond that. 1,500 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet from a ditch will now be considered wetlands. And will require you to get a federal permit and all the costs associated with it just for that development. Folks, it was an unnecessary rule. It particularly damaged eastern North Carolina because farmers, land values are decimated under this rule because they look at their land. They're the original conservationist farmers. They look at their land, and their value of their land is what they can do with it. Well, if you can't farm that land because it's now federal wetlands, your value's just gone down. Your ability to get loans for equipment has been diminished. Your ability to farm has been diminished. Your ability to attract economic business has been diminished. Our ability to maintain our military here in North Carolina has been diminished. Because the federal government has now decided that all of the area just about east of 95, if you ever get an opportunity to see the map that EPA did not want to share until they were forced to share through a congressional subpoena, showing the area, the new area, almost every part of land east of I-95 would be considered wetlands, jurisdictional lands, waters. We thought this was a terrible overreach, an unnecessary overreach by the federal government. And again, Governor McCrory instructed Secretary Vandervaart to stop that rule. We have done that. We've got a stay, another stay, legal stay, holding off the application of that rule until a judge gets a chance to look at it. So those are the two very big rules that we thought were federal overreaches. Again, I wouldn't be so upset if I didn't know. I spent 23 years in this department. I know that North Carolina does a great job protecting its environment. I know we know how to do it. So we don't need the federal government coming here, and what we need is leadership that prevents them from coming in and doing that, and that's what we're trying to provide. So those were the sort of the overviews. Again, customer service, energy, and we try to cover all those areas, and then some of these miscellaneous but very important issues. So I thank you very much for your attention and appreciate the invitation.